In today's video, we will learn that preparations for the rapture have already begun, as America's wheat and chaff are currently being separated in accordance with America's two-party fault line. Currently, the American right is strongly positioned as wheat in accordance with our biblical precepts, while the American left progressively drifts further and further away as chaff in opposition to those precepts. Granted, not all Republicans will be ushered into heaven, nor will all Democrats be destined for hell. But rather, our American divide simply assures that the wheat will be weighted far heavier with the right than the left. But know in advance that the Lord does nothing hurriedly, and that the rapture will not be happening in our immediate future, though it will occur relatively soon. Also know that the current friction from America's divide is actually quite minor in comparison to the time in which the mark of the beast is finally mandated for injection under the skin. During that season, many saints will drift away from the faith in order to live in convenience. Before we begin, please hit the like button and also subscribe to my channel in order to hear teachings that you will not find anywhere else. Even better, please share this video with others in order to help spread the word that the kingdom of God is at hand. Thank you for watching. Today, it's quite common to hear that America hasn't been this divided since the Civil War, which was a war primarily fought between white Republicans and white Democrats, as the Confederates were, unbeknownst to many, the Southern faction of the Democrat Party. And ever since that time, a fault line between the two has existed, with sporadic minor rumblings and occasional rumors of another Civil War-like eruption on the horizon. Mindful of that, the purpose of this video is to examine the primary underlying spiritual conditions that this American divide has been centered upon, being found in Matthew 3:12, whose fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor and gather his wheat into the garner, but he will burn the chaff with unquenchable fire. So who are the wheat whom Jesus will gather for his garner of heaven, and the chaff who will burn with hell's unquenchable fire? On the surface, the obvious answer would be that the wheat bound for heaven are the born-again saints, while the chaff destined for hell are those who have rejected Christ. But just below the surface, the separation of American wheat and American chaff is most clearly seen through the fault line that separates the left from the right, because looking at the current platforms of both the Republican and Democrat Party makes it easy to see which party best aligns with biblical precepts, being the very same biblical precepts that our concept of heaven and hell each originate from. After all, the American left, being Democrats, and the American right, being Republicans, have different platforms. On the left, we have pro-choice, with pro-life on the right, anti-prayer in school for the left, pro-prayer in school for the right. Left currently leans pro-Palestine, right is solidly pro-Israel. Left currently leans socialism, right is capitalism. Cancer culture to the left, pro-free speech to the right. The left is anti-Second Amendment, with pro-Second Amendment to the right. Left is pro-same-sex marriage, right is anti-same-sex marriage. Left is pro-union, right has right to work. Defund police to the left, support the police to the right. From this perspective, it's easy to see which party best aligns with biblical precepts, once again being the same biblical precepts that our concept of heaven and hell also originate from. However, before going any further, please do not get the wrong idea. I am not trying to say that the saints are Republicans who are going to heaven, while the sinners are the Democrats going to hell, because I'm not saying that at all, nor am I even trying to imply it. But rather, let it be known that there will most certainly be Republicans going to hell, just as certainly as there will be Democrats going to heaven. So please do not misunderstand me. After all, the key to heaven rests solely in just one thing, being born again in Christ, while political ideology has nothing to do with it. However, having said that, Know that I am also confident that due to the current platforms of those two parties, as well as the long history of both parties, that from the American perspective, heaven will be weightier with the American right than left. As our current fault line exists with a gray area in which born-again Democrats will be raptured into heaven while sinner Republicans won't. Though of course the Lord will also have to sort out independents and libertarians as well. Next, on a worldwide basis, the key to heaven will remain constant in having to be born again, but the manner in which the dividing line between the two will vary from nation to nation. However, regardless as to how the future unfolds, by far and away the dividing line will easily be most evident whenever the mark of the beast is finally mandated. With that foundation now laid, let's begin. As I prepared my notes for this video, I was reminded by the speech that President Joe Biden recently gave in Atlanta to support the so-called Protecting Voter Rights Act, in which he said, "Here's one thing every senator, every American should remember. History has never been kind to those who've sided with voter suppression over voters' rights, and it'll be even less kind to those who side with election subversion. So I ask every elected official in America, how do you want to be remembered? The consequential moments in history, they present a choice. Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis?" Notice that one little phrase. History has never been kind to those who've sided with voter suppression, through which he implied that history has not been kind to George Wallace, Bull Connor, nor Jefferson Davis, all three of which were Democrat, while Abraham Lincoln is arguably the most famous Republican of all time. Granted, I don't profess to understand what point our Democrat president tried to make when he called out those three Democrats for their voter suppression, while simultaneously exalting Abraham Lincoln. But Biden was correct to say that the consequential moments in history, they present a choice. According to Carol Swain, retired professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University, since its founding in 1829, the Democrat Party has fought against every major civil rights initiative and has a long history of discrimination. The Democrat Party defended slavery, started the Civil War, opposed Reconstruction, founded the Ku Klux Klan, imposed segregation, perpetrated lynchings, and fought against the Civil Rights Act of the 1950s and 60s. In contrast, the Republican Party was founded in 1854 as an anti-slavery party. Its mission was to stop the spread of slavery into the new Western territories with the aim of abolishing it entirely. Democrats opposed the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, the 14th Amendment to give citizenship to black people, the 15th Amendment to give voting rights to black people, all three of which passed due to overwhelming Republican support. With regard to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 80% of Republican representatives were in favor of the bill, while less than 70% of Democrats were. Obviously, the only reason that the Democrats were given credit for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is simply because it was enacted under a Democrat president whose deep-seated bigotry had long been common knowledge. While in conjunction with that, today there's a new movement called critical race theory, which has only one underlying goal: to rewrite American history in such a way as to categorically shift America's racial past away from the Democrat Party and onto all whites as a whole. In so doing, critical race theory is literally nothing more than a path of least resistance that teaches simplicity over historical accuracy, as blaming all whites for slavery, white supremacy, and white privilege is certainly much simpler than distinguishing white Democrats from white Republicans and then having to list line-by-line examples while explaining their historical differences, as that would constitute the path of most resistance, and thus place historical accuracy over simplicity. And since it's human nature for us to always desire to flow along our paths of least resistance, blaming all whites sets the tone of simplicity that in turn makes it far easier to shift the historical fault from the white left onto all whites as a whole. In so doing, this subtle mind control makes it quite easy for non-whites to cast blame upon all whites, as well as to make weak-minded whites feel guilty about something they had neither control nor participation in. Regardless, the entire goal of critical race theory is to shift blame for America's racial past to whites as a whole, as opposed to white Democrats, meaning that critical race theory doesn't even bother to teach that it was the white Republicans who freed the slaves from the white Democrats, nor does it teach that the Confederates were the Southern faction of the Democrat Party, nor does it teach that the Democrats were the party of the slave owners. Unfortunately, those who are ignorant of history will be the most susceptible to this ruse that seeks to shift the center of America's racial divide from its historical center between white Republicans and white Democrats to now being between whites and non-whites, through which whites as a whole are blamed for America's racial past. As critical race theory seeks to blur the lines of truth through the use of what is simple over what is actually true. But then again, the left has always blurred the lines in such matters. For instance, just consider free speech. After all, Joe Biden has a very long history of racist remarks, with video to document them, yet the left still elected him as president. However, when a video emerged of Joe Rogan making a racist remark, suddenly the left is outraged at Joe Rogan being a problem. Along with that, today's cancel culture has targeted Joe Rogan over his supposed COVID misinformation, while that very same cancel culture remained eerily silent during the 3 straight years of daily Russian collusion misinformation by virtually every news organization nationwide. Because, in the minds of cancel culture, freedom of speech only applies to those whom they agree with, having chosen to adopt some of the same old brown shirt tactics that the Nazis also favored. And with regard to capitalism versus socialism, know that the far left desperately desires to see prosperity within our nation, so long as that prosperity doesn't infiltrate their districts. Because what the far left desires is to redistribute wealth from the prosperous areas of the nation and into their own districts through welfare programs that force their constituents to remain dependent on them, as keeping their constituents in bondage to welfare programs ensures their ability to remain in office through the votes of those who continuously depend upon those programs. In fact, that's exactly why some politicians don't want large corporations to establish headquarters in their districts, simply because those higher paying jobs and ripple effects of wealth throughout those districts would weaken their political clout, because the citizens of those districts would no longer be as dependent for the government welfare programs that those politicians love to use in order to buy their votes with. Meaning that the longer those politicians can keep their districts in poverty and dependent upon those programs, then the citizens' fear of losing those programs is what ensures their loyalty of votes, which is exactly why so many longtime Democrat-controlled districts have, year over year and decade over decade, failed to improve. In closing, please understand that regardless of whenever the time finally comes, that the separation of wheat and chaff has already begun. And in the United States, that divide is most clearly seen along our red and blue party lines, though worldwide that divide will once again vary from nation to nation. And with regard to America's current divide between the far left's desire for socialism over America's traditional capitalist roots, Walter E. Williams marvelously wrote, "Prior to capitalism, the way people amassed great wealth was by looting, plundering, and enslaving their fellow man. Capitalism made it possible to become wealthy by serving your fellow man."